Thank you. My paper deals with the globalization of Balkan Gypsy music in commercial markets by relating its consumption and production to issues of representation. I explore strategies through which non-Roma perform, appropriate, and represent Gypsy music. Noting that Roma are rarely in charge of their own representations, as Professor Hancock has pointed out many times, I investigate how the image and the sound of the fantasy Gypsy is created, and who participates in and who benefits from the popularization of Gypsy music. And I'm using the word Gypsy because that's the marketing term, okay? So I have to use it in order to show you exactly why it's problematic. This project has current resonance, of course, because a rising tide of xenophobia and anti-Gypsyism under the rubric of nationalism is sweeping Europe precisely at the time that Gypsy music has become a hot commodity. So I think from somebody like me who studied music in Romani communities for so long, now moving toward non-Romani use of Romani materials, I ask, who is collaborating with whom, who's appropriating from whom, and how are power relationships embedded in these exchanges? So this project that has to do with club culture and DJs is actually in progress, and I would really like your comments on it. But before we begin, I wanted to show you a short video, and this is a promotional video from Robert Schokol, who actually trademarked the term Balkan Beats, and this is his monthly club in Berlin, the Lido Club. So I'll play a little of it right now. Can I get a little louder? Okay, while Ellie sets me up for my PowerPoint, I'll introduce what you're going to see. So I'm talking about a very active and very popular club culture that exists in every major West European city, in New York, in San Francisco, starting up actually right now in Chicago as well, and in the periphery of the Balkans. So it does exist, for example, in Ljubljana, but not in Beograd, for example. And I'm talking about hundreds of DJs who spin what they call either Balkan beats or Gypsy music or Gypsy brass music. The words these days tend to be interchangeable: Balkan, brass, Gypsy. And even circus, some people say circus. And they're very, very well connected, and they have a lot of reciprocity. So it is a kind of club culture and a subculture. In these hundreds of DJs, I have found a few from the Balkans. Let me go on ahead here. A few from the Balkans, just a few, and actually of all of them, just one Romani person. The one Romani DJ that I was able to find got his training as a DJ because he was a busboy in the Ost Club in Vienna, and the other DJs noticed that he was actually really grooving to their sets, their DJ sets, and said, "Oh, you know this music?" He said, "Yeah, that's my music. I'm from Prilep, Macedonia." And they said, "Oh, well, you might know something about this. Do you want to learn how to be a DJ?" And they actually trained him to be a DJ. But the scene is overwhelmingly non-Romani. And I wanted to introduce you to a few of the images, and later on we'll get back to the images. So Who goes to these clubs? Well, the clientele is young, mostly young. If you compare it to other types of youth and club cultures, there's more alcohol but less drugs, so it's considered a kind of safe scene. It actually grew out of the interest in live Romani music that exploded after 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down and a lot of Balkan and other East European Roma could travel for the first time. And so at that moment, you had a lot of live Romani music also in Western Europe, and now it's becoming more DJ-mediated music. And for those of you that don't know what I mean by DJs, I mean people who sample and then add backbeats, or sometimes they're called collectors. They just string various things together. And most of their materials come from the Balkans, and usually brass, and I'll get into that later on. But if you look at some of the imagery here and some of the terminology, another night of lush and gypsy mayhem, Balkan luxuries and exhilarant dancers. So, and you can see the imagery of traveling, cars, trains. This is the Balkan Beats Club in Antwerp, Belgium, just last April. Huge crowd. Sometimes there is a video DJ or a VJ who does imagery. And the imagery that they project in the clubs tends to be generic Roma. Like, it doesn't matter if they're playing a Balkan piece, they'll show something from Rajasthan or Egypt. Whatever Romani images are around, they don't match. It's not an ethnographic task of matching the image with the music. So it's a very big scene, and this is DJ Robert Schoko's monthly club at the Lido in Berlin. This is right here in San Francisco, and you can go to some of these things. They're coming up very soon. I can tell you the dates. Kafana Balkan, which is a combination of a DJ show and live brass band. And this one is from New York, from Mechanata, which is Bulgarian word for a tavern, and the World Music Gypsy Dance Party. There's a number of DJs there, including a few from the Balkans. In terms of the numbers, this is the Berlin club where most of it happens, and I was leaving at about 3 a.m. and there were 300 people waiting to get in. So it is a very big scene. I'm going to move on here. So I don't have to remind this audience, but maybe I think I should, that this comes about at a specific socio-cultural political moment in Europe, in the European scene, where Roma have the lowest rates of education, political participation, social integration. There's really a crisis in not only Romani politics, but also in Romani life and Romani culture. And this is erupting into physical violence and intimidation in some of the very places that this club culture is happening. Also, we have to remember that this is East European music being appreciated in Western Europe, and that can't be divorced from the issue of migration of actual Roma from Eastern Europe to Western Europe and the resulting panic that is going on in Western Europe. Just to point for a few of the really horrendous things that were going on in the last few years, the fingerprinting of Italian Roma in 2009, French expulsions back to Romania and Bulgaria last year, and ongoing, at the very present moment, German, Dutch, etc., expulsions of Roma back to Kosovo. And the other manifestations of violence against Roma, physical violence against Roma, are happening exactly at the same time as well. The Hungarian Guard, supported by the Jobbik Party, is active in Romani villages, patrolling Hungarians against Roma, and yet they won 17% of the 2010 parliamentary vote. And just last few weeks ago, in all over Bulgaria, there were anti-Romani protests in the streets. Even the Wall Street Journal noted this, that more than 160 people were arrested during successive nights of protest against the Roma community. So to me, this brings up very important issues of representation. What are we learning about Roma and Romani culture? And in the literature about fusion forms of music, there tends to be a kind of celebration of hybridity, and everybody can share everybody's music these days because we live in a global society. society, but I think we have to look at who benefits from this, what are the hierarchies of power, in other words, what are the economic and political contexts of this music. So the word Balkan beats was actually trademarked by Robert Šoko, a Bosnian DJ who lives in Berlin, and in his early career in the early 90s, several of his neighborhood friends came to hear him spin DJ music, and it was more of a Balkan atmosphere, and he called it Balkan beats. Through the years, there have been fewer Balkan people going to these clubs and more West Europeans. And in all the clubs I went to, I didn't see any Roma at all. I did bring my host, a Macedonian Romani man, with me to a club in Cologne, and I got his take afterwards. He was pretty surprised that this was going on. He couldn't really understand it. He wasn't upset by it until I told him what the DJ was making for that night, because I did interview the DJ. It was 2,000 euros. Then he got pretty upset. So here's Robert Šoko in his home in Berlin. He comes from Bosnia, and here he is spinning. He's more of a collector. He doesn't do very many backbeats or samples or loops. There are many kinds of DJ styles, and I don't have the time here to actually talk about them. So again, in the literature on fusion musics, on digital music, there's a lot of celebration of now everybody has every style available to them. And while I appreciate some of this literature, I'm very critical myself, because basically the issue of appropriation has been used historically to discredit Roma. Roma have been accused of never having music of their own and always taking from other people. But to me, when DJs take from Roma, the power hierarchies are inverted. So the DJs from the dominant society are taking from the minority society. That doesn't make the minority society any more powerful at all. So appropriations happen in all directions, but power hierarchies don't necessarily get mitigated by appropriations. And just for a second or two, I will mention celebrity patronage, which again happens a lot in minority musics. And here is Madonna with Vadim Kolpakov and his uncle, and also a Jewish violinist from Ohio. And so we also have to think about how do non-Roma get to know about Romani music through what kinds of channels, such as Madonna, and is that good, bad, or how does it affect the person we have to talk about in detail in terms of the kinds of music that is played in clubs is Goran Bregović, who worked with Emir Kusturica on his early movies, although not in his later movies, although many people attribute his later movies to Bregović incorrectly. And so he pioneered a kind of fusion style, which many people say he stole. He's really the wrath of many, many Balkan musicians from them. And he pioneered it as a kind of Balkan brass multicultural music. Here he is in one of his album covers. He's also written an opera, a new version of Carmen. You can see probably, I'm not sure where these Roma are from, perhaps Romania, in front of a Malaysian city, I'm not quite sure. But again, with a car, the nomadism there. So a lot of the stereotypic images are there. Here he is at the Balkan Traffic Festival in Brussels, and later on I'll show you that he got higher billing than anybody else, even the Romani bands from which he draws his material. And you can see he uses fusion forms, sometimes village singers, liturgical quartets, chamber music, and brass bands. And so he's a very pivotal figure. It turns out that in these clubs, about 95% of the music is Balkan brass music, most of it taken from Goran Bregović. Okay? The other part of the music tends to be string, acoustic string music, and some klezmer music. And maybe in the discussion later on we can talk about why Jewish music would show up in a Gypsy label or a Balkan label. So here's the poster from the Balkan Traffic Festival from last year, and you can see that Goran Bregović has top billing with a rock group from Turkey, Duman, but the imagery actually is Marko Marković on either side of the top billing there. So in the literature and ethnomusicology, people talk about celebratory versus anxious narratives of world music. And in the celebration camp are these sort of, music is available to everybody. And all of the DJs I spoke to definitely saw themselves as multicultural artists. They emphasized creativity, and they said that they were actually breaking down stereotypes rather than contributing to them. Anxious narratives in general come from various sources. They come from people who are afraid that pure musics are being diluted around the world. I'm not in that camp at all. I'm not worried about the purity of Romani music at all. What I'm worried about is the socioeconomic underpinnings of these exchanges. So for example, these folks are young guys who play play a series of events called the Balkan Circus, and they hardly get paid at all. They are very devoted and will do things for the love of it. This man, however, is Chantel, the highest paid DJ in Europe, and his album Planet Paprika was very, very, very successful, and here he is doing a set. And just to end with, I would like to show you some of the names and the imagery that the DJs use. The names that they have for themselves are Gypsy Jungle, Gypsy Box, Gypsy Fever, Gypsy Sound System, the Tsiganization Project. The imagery they use is circus imagery, brass music, mobility. So you get these things recycled. And the last thing I'd like to leave you with is this particular image. Did you say my time was out? Yeah, okay. Okay, I just glanced that. This particular image called the Trumpetnikov, which is a combination of the trumpet and the Kalashnikov. With the Kalashnikov, we know it as a gun, but it actually is the name of a tune, a song that Goran Bregovic wrote or took from Romani tradition. And to me, it's a very upsetting image because of the violence assumed in it. But for the DJ himself, he thought it was a kind of artistic rendering. And some of these DJs actually are involved in other kind of social liberation projects in their home countries, like this particular man is involved in Spanish workers' rights. But when I brought up to him many issues involved in his use of the imagery, he had never ever thought of it before. Okay, well, I'd like to end my presentation just with one more imagery, and that is that many of the labels that produce these kinds of fusion musics, they claim that they are actually helping multiculturalism in Europe, so that there would be a place called Electric Gypsy Land where people actually would live together. And I would like to counter that I actually do not think that that the scene in the clubs is helping to counteract xenophobia, and it actually may be promoting a fantasy gypsy that leads actually to more xenophobia. Thank you.